I'm David Azamendi, data architect and data consultant, and today we're going to be looking at the PowerShell and REST APIs for Microsoft Fabric. So let's get started. So why we should be looking at the PowerShell and REST API within Microsoft Fabric. So today we'll cover a few things that I believe that are quite important, and the reason for that is mainly automation. It's always about trying to automate processes, and the more automation we build, the less risk we're going to take on developing solutions. But at the same time, we want to find the right balance. So we don't want to over-engineer a process, okay? And I know that many of us, we've seen that in the past. So finding the right balance between building automation and delivering a valuable outcome for the organization, in a sense of optimizing the process, reducing risk, and so many benefits that you get out of from PowerShell and the REST APIs in Microsoft Fabric. So let me go and share my screen, and we'll start looking at a little bit agenda for today and some of the key items. So today we'll focus essentially on two main items. What the Fabric APIs are, what real scenarios are available out there. And actually, I'm going to show you some of the scenarios that are already available, built by some of our peers in the industry, that I think that they are quite valuable. When you look at the REST APIs, essentially we have so many. Look at that. This is how many modules, let's say, we have as part of the REST APIs. There are so many options within those modules. So if you go and have a look at the documentation for the REST APIs, and I've been using some of the Power BI REST APIs in the past, this grew so much. So you can see the different modules for the REST API. Let's make this bigger. And within each module, you get a different set of endpoints that you can use. Let's look at a specific example. The data marts within Power BI. So if you want to list the data marts, they give you exactly the different, the endpoint that you can use, and if it has any parameters that you have to pass as part of the request. And here you always get an example. In this case, give me the data marts that are available within this workspace, and it will give you the response of the API will be, the data marts that you're looking for. Some of the most useful APIs, they'll be across the different modules. Let's look at some of the ones that we use on our day-to-day work. So let's look at one that is, as an example, limits items, semantic model, list, update semantic model, get semantic models, list semantic models. I'm looking for the refresh, that I wonder if this will be part of the Power BI REST APIs. So you can see that now, on top of the Fabric ones, you have to factor in the Power BI ones. And here in the Power BI ones, you will see as well that we have a set of REST APIs that you can use. This is where it becomes a little bit confusing, because before you only had the Power BI REST APIs, and now you also have the Microsoft Fabric REST APIs. And the one that I was looking for, it was this one here, refresh a dataset within the Power BI REST APIs. So this one, many of you have been using, if you've been taking advantage of PowerShell and the REST APIs, this is a good example, right? So if as part of an application external to the Microsoft Fabric environment, you want to refresh a dataset, a semantic model, you basically have to execute this request to this specific endpoint. And in the case of the Power BI ones, you can also go and try. So if you hit try, this is going to use your credentials, and you will have to pass the parameters. In this case, let's continue. Pass the dataset ID that you want to refresh. This will help you troubleshoot this endpoint. So execute the refresh of the semantic model. You have a lot of options for the request that you can use. And you also have an example of the response, essentially. In this case, you can see, because we are refreshing a semantic model, it's a post request. We're not just listing information. We're sending a request. We're commanding the endpoint to do something. And within the request, we get essentially the ID here of that specific refresh, that you can then use a different endpoint to understand if that refresh has finished correctly with failure or is still running. So it's a little bit of a combination of the Power BI REST APIs and the Fabric REST APIs. In an ideal world, so we like to see the two main components, Power BI REST APIs and the Fabric REST APIs, all of them living under the same umbrella and documentation. Within the Fabric ones, this is growing rapidly, because remember, so Fabric is a product that has been available generally available only for 18 months, so we can expect the number of REST APIs to keep growing. So a few things that I've seen, that right now I like to do, but the REST API is not yet available. So in the case, I'll give you a few examples. The first one, so if you want to start and stop, start and pause a Fabric capacity, currently you don't have an endpoint within the Fabric REST API that you can use. You have to go to the Azure endpoints to be able to pause and start the Microsoft Fabric capacity. Hopefully, near in the future, we'll have an endpoint that we can do with that. Another one, and I will show you one thing that we were able to do with the pipelines, with the data factory pipelines. We were able to start a data pipeline using the REST APIs in Azure Data Factory. Within the Microsoft Fabric REST APIs, we don't have that capability in here. And the reason why I mentioned, two scenarios where maybe we don't have a REST API to accomplish a specific activity is to highlight that actually, there is a gap maybe between what's available and what you're trying to achieve as part of your automation scenario. Something to remember. But this is absolutely great. So having so many REST APIs that we can use is going to help us build automation. Now, if you are working in a small organization, maybe that's not as important. If you're just a team of 2 or 1 data analytics member, it's not as important. But if you are working in a large organization, or you are a software as a service provider, so you build software, automation is at the core of engineering, and that's going to save you a lot of time. So imagine a scenario where you want to deploy multiple lakehouses for multiple customers across different workspaces. So let's pick up that one as an example. So basically, we'll need an API that can help us create workspaces. In that case, maybe we'll have to navigate to the Power BI endpoints. Let's sign out here and stop this option. So we have to come to in here under groups. Basically, we need the APIs to create groups. I wish this was called instead of groups workspaces. But remember that scenario, we're trying to create multiple workspaces for multiple customers with multiple lakehouses. So here we have an endpoint that we can use to create multiple workspaces. So basically, we'll use this specific endpoint to create workspaces. then we also need an endpoint to create lakehouses. So if I navigate back to our Fabric REST APIs, I'll say, okay, do we have a module for lakehouses? Yes, we have one here. And do we have an endpoint that we can use to create lakehouses? And the answer is yes. You have an endpoint to create, delete, and update lakehouses. So the three main operations, when you think of CRUD operation, create, read, update, delete, you can see them here: get, create, delete, update. So they are there. So you have an endpoint here that is going to help you create lakehouses automatically. So you can see how, depending on the scenario that you're trying to achieve, you can go and query on the different modules and see what's available from an offering point of view when you're trying to build out automation. Remember, anything related to automation, so it is at the core of engineering, but you don't want to over-engineer at the same time. So I've seen people taking advantage of REST APIs, and I've been taking advantage of REST APIs, especially in scenarios where we have to perform the same activity or provision the same environment multiple times for multiple customers, for multiple departments, if you're using a specific, like a federated operating model and things like that. You can use automation. Another scenario could be that you rely on a specific department for creating resources. So the traditional, let's say, IT department that they use YAML pipelines to create environments, test development environments, they can take advantage of the different modules and endpoints to create an environment for you with the items that you need. So this is a quick look, of all the different endpoints that are available to us from the get-go when trying to build automation. So let me give you a few examples on how you can use the endpoints for different scenarios. And for today, actually, I selected a few things from the community because some of them, I think they're really cool and I've been using them. And the first one that I want to show you is one from Lori blog post. You can see this one. This one here is a blog post essentially about getting the tenant settings. And think about this, not everybody is able to access the tenant settings. And even if you get access to the tenant settings, and a quick reminder that we're talking about the tenant settings is basically the information here. When you go to settings, you have to be an admin of Fabric. You go to the admin portal, you have all these settings here. And this continues, it's changing. Every time that I come here, there's a new option. Because how do you govern this, And it's all, let's be honest, it's difficult to read. It's really difficult to read, to understand. Is this enable, disable? Did somebody change this? So, and on the other hand, not everybody has access to this, only Fabric admins. Maybe this is some information that you want to make available to developers. This is a good scenario where you can use essentially the REST APIs to build a nice Power BI report. So let's go and have a quick look at Lori's blog post, and we'll focus on this PowerShell scripting here. So you can see that the first step, let me open Summit so we can make some notes. And let me go dark mode here, it's easier to read. All right. So this script will essentially capture the settings of the admin settings within there. The first step, when using PowerShell to trying to leverage the REST APIs, is of course, importing the modules that you need because you have to log in. And in this case, it's going to log in with your credentials. You can see it in here. We're going to look later at the scenario where it is not using your credentials. But from an admin point of view, in here, we log in with our credentials. we prepare some variables, and then we're going to essentially invoke the request to get the tenant settings, which is here. So this is basically the endpoint, and this is the method that we're trying to use to get the information from that endpoint. So you can see, so we're combining that specific endpoint to get that information, and then we'll save that information within a specific file. Let's see what happened with file name. You'll put the file name, and then you can import that information within the Power BI report and make that information available to your users. But this is all taking advantage of the REST APIs. So if I go back to our previous window, and we'll try finding this specific scenario, I'm going to guess that it is either in the Fabric REST APIs or the Power BI API. So if I go here, admin, and here we try to search for tenant, and I haven't done this before. So we try finding that specific endpoint. Let's copy that endpoint one more time. So tenant settings. Let's see if we find it, and if not, we'll move on. So this will be a get method, and the easiest thing to do for us is to use the search option here. Okay, now we ended up with a lot of information that we need, but even though if I don't find it now, I wanted to show you a real scenario. I was trying to find the tenant settings in here. It should be under admins. So let's see, find it. And if we don't find it, that's fine. We'll move on. I think you get the idea. So many REST APIs across different items, and here I don't know it's going to be. This is more related to admin. I'm sure it's going to be in one of these sections, so difficult to navigate. But this is a really simple scenario where you leverage a specific endpoint, you get the tenant settings, you put that into a file, and then you make that file available for reporting. You can see simple scenario, right? So this is using our own user credentials. Now let's go one step further, right? So let's say that we want to build an environment for one of the departments, or we want to automate the creation of environments for different customers. So I'll show you different PowerShell script. So this scripting here, let me zoom in. So this basically is a set of PowerShell scripts that help you create an environment. There are so many things that you can do. In this example, so we can see that we have a PowerShell script that creates a lakehouse. So basically, as in PowerShell, we're trying to make things reusable. So workspace name, the lakehouse name, do we want to create, do we want to delete? And based on that, those parameters in PowerShell, in this case, we don't use the user's credentials. In here, we're taking advantage of creating an application within the Azure portal, because we don't want to run this script based on a user credential. You will create an app, and you will use that app ID to be able to create items within the Microsoft Fabric ecosystem. So you can see that it will accept the parameters of a tenant ID, client ID, and client secret. Then it will get the token that we're going to use to make the different requests. And then it will start getting the information that we need to create the lakehouse. In this case, again, so you can see here, we're trying to get the workspace ID based on a workspace name. And you can see how we call this specific endpoint. And then we loop through the different items until we find that specific workspace ID. And it could happen actually in this case, when you look at this, if you have two workspaces with the same name, it will return potentially more than one workspace ID. So let's go and try to find out why that's the scenario. So let's go and look at this specific endpoint. So we navigate back to our REST APIs. In this case, this will be a REST API for Power BI. And we go to Get Groups. So you can see here. So first of all, we have an endpoint to get the workspace name based on the workspace ID. So this means that if you give a workspace ID to this specific endpoint, it will return the information for that workspace. But if we go to Get Groups, in here, basically we don't really have an endpoint to get a workspace ID based on a workspace name. Therefore, we have to list all the workspaces, and based on that, we can filter the workspaces that match our specific name. And that explains why, in some cases, you have to overcome some of the limitations using some of this logic. So let's try to explain this one more time. So this script in here is a sample script, it's going to create a lakehouse in a specific workspace name. But the challenge with the workspace name is that we have to get the ID before we move and create the lakehouse. But we don't have an endpoint to get the endpoint to get the workspace ID based on the workspace name. Therefore, we have to list all the workspaces and then filter out the workspaces that match our specific workspace name, and then we capture the workspace ID. Ideal scenario, when you're using this script as an example, you might say, you might argue that instead of using the workspace name, you should be using the workspace ID. That's a design decision, that's who is going to be using the script, how you're going to be leveraging that script. I suggest as well, you shouldn't have two workspaces with the same name. I don't even know if that's possible, but ideally, you will have to define some governance rules to overcome those scenarios. Here is a real scenario, on how we don't have an endpoint to get the workspace ID based on the workspace name. Therefore, we have to list all the workspaces and then filter out the ones that we don't need. And then for creating the lakehouse, basically, that becomes easy. So once that we have captured the workspace ID, we have a small function here that creates a lakehouse using the workspace ID that we previously captured, and it's going to get the endpoint that we looked at before. So you can see here that we define the specific endpoint to make sure we're going to check if that lakehouse exists. And if it doesn't exist, we're going to go ahead and we have another function that creates that specific lakehouse. You can see. We look at that, and in the import request, this file URL, we pass that information, and more important, the body. So I'm saying we call in this endpoint, and in the body, we pass the name of the lakehouse that we're going to create. And if we look at the endpoint, you will find out basically it's the same idea. So this is the specific parameters that you have to pass to create a lakehouse. Another example could be as well that you're trying to create a specific connection. or copy the reports between different workspaces. When creating connections, this is going to open a lot of new opportunities, right? So here you see a script basically that you pass different information, and this is going to create a connection for us. You will see in this script basically, that we're using a different PowerShell module. And this is where it might be confusing in some cases. So within PowerShell, you can essentially go and use PowerShell and use the endpoints for Microsoft Fabric without having to import a specific Power BI module. But in some cases, Microsoft or the community will build new modules that will help us optimize and minimize how much work we have to do with PowerShell in order to get a specific outcome. So let's go and have a quick look at this module that is available within Power BI. So let's search for this. This means on top of the endpoints and on top of using PowerShell, in some cases you have PowerShell modules that will help you achieve specific activities. And sometimes it'll be better to use the modules that are available in PowerShell, and sometimes you might decide to just go with without having to use the modules and using the endpoints. Here, this is a specific endpoint, and you can see the different activities that you can accomplish. So we have quite a few, from admin to managing capacities, data profiles, and workspaces, and so on. The challenge with PowerShell modules, and let me search for this one more time, and we'll go to the gallery here. The challenge with modules is this one, that sometimes they stop being maintained. So you can see that the latest version that we have for this module, it was released back in 2021. So that means that this module, it will offer specific functionality for Power BI REST APIs, but none of the Microsoft Fabric capabilities is going to be within this specific module. And this is the reason why you have to be cautious as well on using modules in PowerShell, because you have to look at, okay, who is maintaining that specific module? Is this maintained by the provider? Is this like an open source module? So there'll be different levels of risks that you have to factor in. This is the perfect example. This is a module maintained, copyright by Microsoft. It is an excellent module, but somehow back in 2022, I would say this is the latest version, right? This is 1.2, yeah. Back in 2022, we stopped extending this, and this is the last supported version, essentially. We stopped maintaining this. There is no parity, okay? So remember, so one thing, so when you start looking at the REST APIs, the offer in there, so there'll be many things that you cannot do yet, because the product team has to go and make new APIs available and new functionality available. Once those REST API endpoints that are made available, then you have to factor in the next thing. So if there is a PowerShell module that you can take advantage on, that module has to be modified to include new functionality based on those REST APIs. And that's where there is a huge gap sometimes. But there are still good reasons why you might want to use a module. And I'll give you a specific example. When working with this module, one of the things that you are able to do actually is to encrypt credentials easily. And this is another practitioner from our community. You can find this specific script available in GitHub. But this is a specific set of like a modules and information. The combination of creating the connection and encrypting the credentials is something that I found available only by using this specific module here. One more thing to think about. So we're still here, we're using PowerShell, using some endpoints, using some modules. But then what if you want to put this as part of infrastructure as code or continuous integration and continuous deployment? So let's go back to our previous script where we were creating a lakehouse. In here, you can see that some of the parameters is basically creating a tenant ID, using the tenant ID, client ID, and client secret. So when working with endpoints and trying to automate the processes, you have to go and create an app within Microsoft Intra and give that app permissions within the Microsoft Fabric to use the endpoints. But let me show you how that is done. So within your Azure portal, so you will navigate, or the IT team or somebody who has access to this now navigate to Microsoft Intra, and under app registrations. In here, I will show you the step that you have to follow to get that information: the client secret, the client ID, and the tenant ID. You will come here and create a REST specific API. Let's call this test. I don't have to look at any of the other things because this is specifically for using the endpoints and within PowerShell. You will register that endpoint. And we want to capture from here, this is our tenant ID. So if I put side by side, this information, let's move this over here, and we'll bring our other page that I cannot see right now. Where is it? This one here, sorry. Let's make this smaller, put it side by side. Okay, so we're trying to capture essentially, we need the tenant ID. So this one here, we need the client ID, which is that one there. And we also need the secret. So when we're registering an app, so one of the options that you have in here is certificates and secrets. So you will come here, create a new secret. You cannot go further than 2 months, and you want to make sure that you rotate the keys. So that's why the recommended option is 160 days, like test secret. And this will give you a value here that you can use to execute the PowerShell scripts and the endpoints. Now, I'm going to delete this one because we don't need it right now. Once that you have that information, essentially we have the tenant ID, the client secret, and the client ID. Then ideally you will put that in Key Vault, and you will come to your library and potentially create a library that syncs the information from the Key Vault. But essentially you want to store those values securely, ideally in Azure Key Vault. If you are not using Azure Key Vault, you can also create a variable group and put that information in here. But I will highly recommend doing this within an Azure Key Vault. Give a meaningful name, REST API, endpoints, and I'll show you how this comes together. So now we have all the information that we need available within Azure DevOps to execute that script as part of a pipeline. So when you are creating a pipeline, and I'm going to show you an example. Let's go with the Create Lakehouse example. it's empty for some reason, or we'll apply some changes. So let's see. Okay, this is it. So when creating the pipeline, the YAML pipeline that you're going to use in Azure DevOps, basically you want to reference the group where you're going to have the secret, the client ID, the tenant ID, as well as any other variables that you want to reuse across different deployments, right? But you will reference the information in here. In some cases, you will define parameters if you want to do that on demand as well. And then it's essentially just, executing the PowerShell script that is expecting us to pass the parameters that we need to create the lakehouse. You can also see in this case how we print some information for troubleshooting, but this is how it comes together essentially. So that means that we have in our repo, we have the PowerShell scripts that are going to help us take advantage of the endpoints. And the PowerShell script, they give us one more level of abstraction and control on how we want to use the endpoints. In this case, you can see we can control that we can do only create and delete, define the logic here. And when we want to embed this as part of our infrastructure as code or continuous integration and deployment, you can create a YAML pipeline that will allow you to call as many PowerShell scripts as you need and use the variable groups that ideally they'll be synced with Azure Key Vault to create the lakehouse. I don't want to go in detail, but this, you can see that opens a lot of opportunities. If you are looking at creating hundreds of lakehouses and hundreds of workspaces across different customers, this is where it becomes really useful for us to take advantage of automation. This is more common scenario. So remember, we started from a really simple scenario where we were essentially just getting some information of the tenant settings to create a Power BI report. And now we moved towards a scenario that is more about automation using the REST APIs and endpoints and the different modules within PowerShell, Azure DevOps, and YAML pipelines to do infrastructure as code, continuous integration, and continuous deployment. And remember that there is a previous step that you have to create the API. Before I forget, once that you create the API, and you've seen me creating that API before in Microsoft Intra. Let me see. We go back to our Microsoft Intra API. So once that you create this, and you have captured that information as part of the variable groups and so on, one thing that we haven't done is giving access this specific application to be able to use the REST APIs and endpoints. So here is my recommendation. The first thing, create a group within Microsoft Intra with the different, let me see, this will be called Power BI. So in this case, I created a group where all the members of this group, they will be able to use the REST APIs and endpoints within Fabric and Power BI. And in here, the idea is that you will come and you will add that specific application that you created to this group. So let's go back one step. Let's find our API, and in here, I don't know if the groups are within here. No, this is Microsoft Intra Groups. I don't see it. But I'm sure there's a way of doing that from here. But another way, let me see. This will show up now into potentially enterprise applications. Let's see. So this is the one that we created before. Click on it, And here under users and groups, sorry, I'm navigating to a different section just to assign this application to a group. And we'll assign this to this specific group. Because we want to use this group. So this group is the one that we're going to give all the members of that group will have access to use the REST APIs and endpoints within Microsoft Fabric. And then we'll navigate again one more time to our beautiful admin tenant. And there are two things here that you have to look at when giving access to use the REST APIs. And if I search here, sorry, let's go to the top. And those ones are called, I think, let me see. Let's find them manually. So it's not called, I'm trying to find out, it's called APIs. There you go. Okay, so the two sections where you want to give that application access is service principals can use Fabric APIs. And you can see here that I have added that specific group so they can use the REST APIs. And definitely you want to look at the other ones available to you. Okay, depending on what you're trying to achieve. In this case, you know, if we want to use a lot of the admin APIs, you might want to enable this as well. And you can see that we have some options to use some of the information related to, you know, the data metadata and so on. So here you can see that I have added that group. So it's like a two-step process, remember. So first, you have to create the application that you're going to use to execute the automation. And the second one, of course, is giving that application access. And ideally, you want to do that through a group. So you have some more control as well on adding and removing new members without having to go to the admin settings every time that you want to give access to. So that's how it all comes together. So use a simple scenario, now automation scenario, and I want to show you something a little more advanced. I've been deploying the Fabric Unified Admin Portal or admin management. So this is an open source application. I highly recommend that go and have a look at this in GitHub. It is new. So this is going to help us monitor. Let me see if I'm in the right place. No, this one. Have a look at this repository. I want to show you a more advanced option of a solution that takes advantage of the endpoints, the REST API endpoints. And in this case, it uses Python to deploy a solution that is going to help you monitor your Microsoft Fabric ecosystem. So in a nutshell, this is great for monitoring your Microsoft Fabric platform. Maybe it is a topic that we can cover next week or the week after on how to deploy this solution. But once that you deploy this solution, it's basically going to deploy all these notebooks, items, reports, lakehouses, pipelines. It's going to deploy all these objects by taking advantage of the endpoints. And the final outcome is basically just having it is a tool for us to monitor the Microsoft Fabric platform. I don't want to go into detail on what the platform does and and what the benefit is, but I want to show you actually how this is being built behind the scenes, how we get from having all these scripts in here to be able to deploy a solution within the Power BI ecosystem. This is a really advanced scenario. I like it a lot. Let me give you a few examples. There is a master script, essentially here, that is going to help you deploy all the objects. But then you will have, it's going to create so many options. So let me just open this one and we'll go through a few examples. I deployed this one yesterday to give you an idea, to have a quick look at it and what it does. I'm going to skip, the nitty-gritty Python detail, and I'm going to go straight to the section where we start creating some of the deployment functions. Here, create connections. Okay, this is a good example. Look, so this script basically is looking at executing a specific Python command based on the library that we have, and so on. But you can see in here that we're starting to take advantage of some of the endpoints that we mentioned before, as well as if we're checking here if that connection exists. Do you remember what I mentioned before, that there are different PowerShell modules that they will make things easier for us to use those endpoints? This library here is the synonym of PowerShell, is the Python idea of this library. So essentially, if we look at this library, okay, this command line, this set of libraries in here is basically, again, making things easier for us to leverage the endpoints, in this case, not in PowerShell, but in Python. And when I drill down the different options in here, you will see that the familiarity between what we see here on creating connections, as well, getting a specific workspace ID, or creating a workspace, aligns quite well as well with the endpoints that are available within the Microsoft Fabric REST APIs. Now, you guys, with this one, I'm trying to say, like, you can use PowerShell modules, you can use Python modules, you can just use PowerShell with calling REST APIs with the Microsoft Fabric or Power BI, or you can use Python just with calling the specific REST APIs and endpoints on Microsoft Fabric. As I mentioned before with the PowerShell modules, remember, so when you are starting to use some of the libraries, in this case, or modules within PowerShell, you are going to rely on the people who are maintaining those libraries and those modules. And that's something that you have to factor in as part of a risk, because maybe that library or that specific module is not being maintained in the future. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, how much, and how much automation you want to build, there is a design decision on using or not the modules. Let me give you a simple scenario. If the only thing that you're looking at is creating, using the Fabric REST APIs, let's see. If you're looking at using the Fabric REST APIs just to create, let's say, a lakehouse, maybe my recommendation would be to just stick to use the REST APIs endpoints straight, without any Python libraries or any PowerShell modules. Just go and build automation and take advantage of this. Now, if you're looking at something which is really advanced and it's going to save you time by using libraries and modules, yeah, go for it. Go and start taking advantage of the PowerShell modules or the different Python libraries that are going to help you save time. But it's really important, remember, so this it'll be maintained by a specific set of users, and maybe in the future is not up to date. So remember, the parity between the REST APIs and what's being offered as part of a PowerShell module and a library is not going to be 100%, never. So REST APIs, the REST API endpoints, they will become available first, and then somebody has to work on making those REST APIs available as part of a PowerShell module or a Python library. So there's going to be always a lag, and it could happen as well that some of the endpoints that are available here, they will never make it to a PowerShell module or a Python library. So this is an advanced scenario. We're going to look at this a little more in detail in the future, but I wanted to show you actually just how with a set of a notebook. This is just a notebook, and by using some of the Python libraries that leverage some of the Microsoft Fabric REST APIs, you can essentially deploy a solution like this one with a lot of notebooks, reports, semantic models. Everything is connected between each other, as well as pipelines, but just leveraging the REST API endpoints. Think about this out of the box, right? Imagine that you were building a product that takes advantage of Microsoft Fabric, and you want to deploy this across multiple customers. So this is a really good example of leveraging those Fabric endpoints to deploy a solution that can be used by multiple customers. You deploy separately. I love it. I love it. I've been looking at this solution. I will stop now. Okay, I think it's a really good example of an advanced scenario of using REST API endpoints. Maybe we're a little bit over time today. Hopefully you learned a little bit of foundations, of the Microsoft Fabric REST APIs, the PowerShell modules, Python, how everything can come together in Azure DevOps with YAML pipelines, and as well some of the takeaways, some of the difference between the Power BI REST APIs, the Fabric REST APIs, some of the missing capabilities or endpoints that are not already yet there, but they'll be available there in the future, as well as some of the considerations, design decisions that you will have to make when taking advantage of PowerShell modules, Python libraries that are maintained by third-party providers. Don't forget to subscribe. If you have any questions, don't forget to connect in the social networks. I know it was a lot of content today, a little bit advanced maybe or basic, but as something that you have to take into account if you are building automation. Remember, automation is one of the key pillars of engineering. So stay tuned and see you next week.